The air on that October morning in '69 tasted of diesel fumes, cheap coffee, and failure. It was the taste of an auction, the final, bitter sacrament for a farm that had bled out slow. My farm, or what was left of my father's farm. I stood by the rusty fence row, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of a worn canvas jacket, feeling the cold seep right through to my bones. It wasn't just the autumn air. It was the cold of watching your whole world get parceled out, tagged with little paper numbers and sold to the highest bidder. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Henderson, with a voice like gravel in a coffee can, was working his way through the machinery line. Dad's John Deere 720, the one he'd bought new, the one I learned to drive on, its Johnny Popper engine, a familiar two-cylinder heartbeat of my childhood, went for a price that felt like a punch to the gut. It was bought by Richard Sterling. Rich was my age, but that's where the similarities ended. His father hadn't bet the farm on one bad year of drought followed by a year of flood. His father owned the bank. Rich stood there in a clean shirt, his hands on his hips, a smirk playing on his lips as the tractor was sold. He nodded at the auctioneer, a casual flick of his chin that said this was nothing more than a Tuesday morning transaction for him. He caught my eye and gave me that same look, a mixture of pity and superiority that made my fists clench in my pockets. "Tough break, Thorne," he said, strolling over as if we were old friends. "But that's the way it goes. Progress waits for no man. Can't make money with old iron." I just stared at him, my jaw tight. The smell of his cologne was an insult, a foreign scent in a place that should only smell of earth and oil. He was already planning. You could see it in his eyes. He'd tear out the old windbreaks, plough fence row to fence row, run big, new equipment. He'd farm with a checkbook, not with his hands. The auction wore on. The haybine, the planter, the old Farmall M that was Dad's first tractor. Each one went under the hammer, another piece of my history sold for pennies on the dollar. I felt hollowed out, a ghost on my own land. Most of the neighbors were decent enough to look away, giving me a sad nod if they caught my gaze. They knew it could have been any one of them. The farm economy was a knife's edge, and my father had slipped. Finally, Henderson got to the end of the line, the place we called the boneyard. It was a tangle of weeds and rusted metal, where old, broken equipment went to die. Pushed up against the far corner, half swallowed by wild grapevines, sat the beast, an Alice Chalmers HD6 bulldozer. Dad had bought it a decade ago from a county surplus sale, thinking he'd fix it up to clear some bottomland. He never did. The Detroit diesel engine was seized, one of the track rollers was shot, and the blade hydraulics leaked like a sieve. It was 10 tons of dead weight, a monument to a project that never got started. "All right, folks, what am I bid on this lawn ornament?" Henderson joked, and a few people chuckled. "Lot number 247, one Alice Chalmers Dozer, as is where is. And believe me, it is where it is. You'll need a winch and a prayer to move it. Let's start the bidding at scrap price. Who'll give me $100? Silence. The wind rustled the dry corn stalks in the field next door. $100 for 10 tons of iron was a fair price, but nobody wanted the headache of hauling it away. $100, gentlemen? That's $10 a ton. You can't beat that, Henderson pleaded. Rich Sterling laughed out loud. You'd have to pay me $100 to take that junk, Henderson. Something snapped in me then. A hot wire of pure, stubborn defiance. It wasn't a thought, not a plan. It was just a feeling. A refusal to walk away with nothing. A refusal to let Sterling have the last laugh. My hand came out of my pocket. I held up one finger. Henderson's eyes lit up. I got $100. $100 bill from the young Thorne boy. Now who'll give $110? $110. Do I hear $110? The crowd looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Sterling just shook his head, that infuriating smirk plastered on his face. He wasn't going to bid. This was beneath him. This was my final, pathetic act, and he was going to enjoy watching it. "Sold!" Henderson's gavel cracked through the air. "For $100 to Caleb Thorne." The auction was over. People started their trucks, their voices fading as they drove away, leaving me alone in the quiet devastation. I walked over to the dozer, the grass crunching under my boots. I laid a hand on the cold, pitted steel of the blade. It was mine. $100 of scrap iron, a pile of problems, and the only thing I had left in the world besides the clothes on my back and the $87 still in my pocket. I spent the rest of that day walking the property lines, saying goodbye. By evening, Rich Sterling's new foreman was there, telling me I had 24 hours to get my personal effects and my bulldozer off the property. He said it with the same casual cruelty as his boss. I didn't have a truck big enough to haul it. I didn't have a place to take it. But I had an idea. I spent the $87 on 2 new 6-volt batteries, a can of ether, 5 gallons of diesel, and a heavy-duty wrench set from the hardware store in town. The rest of the night, I worked under the cold white light of a full moon. I drained the sludgy oil, cleaned the fuel filters with a rag and a bit of gasoline, and tightened every connection I could reach. The pony motor, a small gasoline engine used to start the big diesel, was gummed up, but I took the carburetor apart and cleaned the jets with a piece of wire until it was spotless. At dawn, my hands were raw and black with grease. I filled the little gas tank, hit the starter, and after a dozen sputters and coughs, the pony motor roared to life, a high-pitched scream in the quiet morning. I let it warm up, then engaged the clutch to turn over the big Detroit. It was a slow, groaning process. The whole machine shuddered. Roar, roar. The sound of a seized engine fighting its own rusted guts. I climbed up on the track, pulled the air filter cover, and gave it a quick shot of ether. The effect was instantaneous. A loud metallic crack, a belch of black smoke from the exhaust stack, and then the Detroit diesel caught. It wasn't a smooth idle. It was a rough, hammering, angry roar. A 2-stroke 3071 diesel doesn't purr. It screams and pops and rattles your teeth, but it was running. The ground beneath me vibrated with a power that had been sleeping for a decade. I climbed into the worn steel seat, the levers cold and stiff. I pushed the main clutch forward, pulled back on the steering levers, and with a tremendous groan of protesting metal, the left track dug into the dirt. Then the right. The dozer lurched forward, tearing itself free from the vines and the earth that had tried to claim it. I drove it right past the farmhouse, right past Sterling's foreman, who stood there with his mouth hanging open, and out onto the county road. I didn't look back. Now, before we go any further, I gotta ask you folks a question. Have you ever owned a piece of machinery, a truck, a tool, that just refused to die? Something you brought back from the brink when everyone else said it was scrap? Let me know down in the comments what it was and what it meant to you. Because, for me, that old Alice wasn't just iron. It was a promise, a $100 promise I made to myself that I would never, ever be broken like that again. The next couple of years were the hardest of my life. I had no land, no home. I made a deal with Old Man Hemlock, a retired farmer who had a 40-acre patch of woods and swampland nobody wanted. He let me park the dozer and a beat-up travel trailer I bought for $200 in a clearing at the back of his property in exchange for me clearing a new road for him. That HD6 became my home and my office. Every morning, I was up before the sun, my breath fogging in the cold air of the trailer. I'd make coffee on a little propane stove and eat a piece of toast, then head out to the dozer. The first task of every day was just getting it started. The Detroit was a cantankerous beast. It hated the cold. I learned all its tricks, how much ether to give it without blowing a head gasket, how to bleed the fuel lines just right, how to listen for the specific change in the pony motor's whine that meant the big engine was ready to fire. I took any job I could get, $20 to pull a stump for a neighbor, $50 to dig a small stock pond, $100 to clear a fence row that had gotten overgrown with hedge apples and locust trees. The work was brutal. The HD6 had no cab, just a steel seat and the levers. In the summer, the sun beat down on me, and the heat from the engine was relentless. Dust and dirt coated everything, filling my eyes, my nose, my lungs. In the winter, the wind cut through my jacket like a razor. My fingers would go numb on the steel levers, and the cold would settle deep in my bones, a cold that didn't leave even when I was huddled by the small heater in the trailer at night. The machine was my constant, demanding partner. It broke down constantly. I learned how to weld a cracked push arm with a stick welder powered by a generator. I spent a week on my back in the mud, replacing that bad track roller, the bolts so rusted I had to cut them off with a torch. I learned the guts of that machine better than I knew my own. I could diagnose a problem by the sound it made, by the smell of the exhaust, by the feel of the vibration through the seat. I scavenged parts from junkyards across 3 counties, pulling a hydraulic pump off an old, burned-out machine in one, a set of injectors from another. The whole time, Rich Sterling was the golden boy of Providence County. He had bought my father's land and 2 other farms besides. He traded in his father's old equipment for a brand new fleet of John Deeres. I'd see him drive by in his new pickup truck while I was wrestling a boulder out of some poor patch of ground, and he'd give me a little wave, that same condescending smirk on his face. The talk at the co-op and the diner was always about him. Did you see the size of Sterling's new combine? Heard he put in 1,000 acres of corn this year. That boy's going places. And then there was me. Saw Caleb Thorne out in Hemlock Swamp again. Still wrestling with that old piece of junk. Shame what happened to his family. Kid's never gonna amount to much, playing in the dirt like that. The scorn was thick. I was a ghost, a reminder of failure. I was the guy you hired for cash when you had a dirty job you didn't want to do yourself. They saw a man in greasy clothes running a loud, smoky, obsolete machine. They didn't see what I was doing. I wasn't just moving dirt, I was saving money. Every dollar I made, after fuel and food, went into a coffee can I kept hidden under the floorboards of the trailer. I didn't owe a dime to anyone. That dozer, that trailer, the tools, they were mine, free and clear. One day, I was working on a job for a farmer named Peters, clearing out a patch of timber so he could expand a pasture. It was tough going, thick with oak and hickory. I was using the dozer blade to push over a stubborn old oak, the Detroit screaming at full throttle, the tracks digging for purchase, when one of the main hydraulic lines for the blade lift blew. A fine mist of hot hydraulic fluid sprayed everywhere, all over the engine, all over me. It was a mess, and it was a showstopper. I shut the machine down, the sudden silence ringing in my ears. Just then, Sterling's new John Deere 4630 came roaring down the road, pulling a massive disc. It was the latest and greatest, 150 horsepower, a comfortable air-conditioned, sound-guard cab. He was working the field across the way. He saw me standing there, covered in oil, and pulled his tractor up to the fence. He killed the engine and stepped out of the cab, looking fresh and clean. "Having trouble, Thorne?" he called out, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Blew a line," I said, wiping my face with an already black rag. He looked at the old HD6, a piece of ancient history compared to his gleaming green machine. "You know," he said, leaning against his front tire, "you could save yourself a lot of grief if you just get with the times. I just signed the papers on another quarter section. The bank is practically giving money away right now. You could get a loan, get yourself a decent backhoe, make some real money." "I'm doing all right," I said, my voice flat. "Are you?" He gestured around at the muddy clearing, at my greasy clothes, at the silent, broken-down Dozer. "This is all right? Living in a trailer, breaking your back for pocket change?" "It's a new era, Caleb. A man's got to use leverage. Use the bank's money to make your own. That's how the game is played now." "I don't play that game," I said, turning back to the busted hose. He chuckled. "No, I guess you don't. Well, you have fun with that. Some of us have empires to build." He climbed back into his quiet cab, fired up his tractor with the turn of a key, and drove off in a cloud of dust and progress, leaving me in the silence with my broken machine and the smell of hot oil. The early 1970s arrived, and it seemed like Rich Sterling was right. The world went crazy. An export deal with the Soviets, what the papers called the Great Grain Robbery, sent corn and soybean prices through the roof. A bushel of corn went from $1.25 to $3, then $4. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre was suddenly worth $1,000, then $2,000. The bankers, who used to be the most cautious men in the county, were now the biggest cheerleaders. They were handing out loans to anyone who owned a pair of boots and a deed. The mantra in every coffee shop was, "Get big or get out." Rich Sterling got big. He used his soaring land values as collateral to borrow more, buying up every parcel that came for sale. He bought the new International Harvester 1466 with the black stripe, a tractor that made his John Deere look small. Then he bought a four-wheel drive Steiger, a green monster that could pull a plow the size of a small house. His operation was the talk of the state. He was featured in farm magazines. He was the future. He was building his empire, just like he said, all on the bank's money. He was farming thousands of acres, most of which he didn't truly own. And me? I was still running the HD6. The coffee can was full, and then a second one was full. The odd jobs never stopped. While everyone else was chasing high crop prices, they were also creating work for me. They needed new drainage ditches dug, old barns torn down to make way for bigger machine sheds, land cleared for more acres to plant. My rates were cheap, and I paid for my fuel in cash. I never took out a loan. Finally, in the spring of '74, I had enough. Old man Hemlock had passed away, and his kids, who lived in the city, wanted to sell his 40 acres of woods and swamp. To them, it was worthless land, a tax burden. They couldn't get a real farmer to look at it twice. It was too rocky, too wet, too much work to clear. They just wanted to be rid of it. I went to the county courthouse with a cashier's check made out from my coffee can savings. I bought all 40 acres, outright. No mortgage, no handshake with a banker, no monthly payment. The deed was mine, free and clear. The day I signed the papers, I walked the property lines of my own land for the first time. It wasn't prime bottomland. It wasn't flat and black and ready for a planter. It was a mess of scrub oak, cattails and granite boulders left behind by a glacier 10,000 years ago. But it was mine. I spent the next year doing for myself what I had been doing for others. I started at the back of the property, firing up the old Alice Chalmers every morning and waging a one-man war against the wilderness. I cleared trees, pulled stumps, and piled rocks into massive walls that would serve as property dividers. I dug a deep pond in the lowest spot, draining the surrounding swampland. The work was slow, methodical, and back-breaking. The locals thought I was crazier than ever. Sterling was farming 2,000 acres of the best land in the county, and Caleb Thorne was pushing rocks around on 40 acres of the worst. One afternoon, the county extension agent, a young guy fresh out of college, stopped by. He saw me wrestling a massive granite boulder onto a stone boat I'd fashioned out of an old truck hood. "Thorne," he said, shaking his head. "You know the university's soil maps classify this whole parcel as unsuitable for agriculture. You're wasting your time and burning fuel for nothing." "I reckon the soil's fine underneath all these rocks," I grunted, chaining the boulder down. "Just gotta get to it." "But the economics of it make no sense," he insisted. "The man-hours, the cost. You'll never get a return on this investment. Land like this is a liability." I just looked at him, then at the deed in my back pocket, then at the roaring, smoking, fully paid-for machine sitting behind me. "It's not a liability," I said, "if you don't owe anybody anything for it." He didn't get it. Nobody did. They were all looking at the boom, at the price of corn, at the shiny new tractors. They couldn't see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. But I could. I'd listened to the old-timers at the hardware store, men who'd lived through the 30s. They'd watch the young farmers signing loan papers for a $250,000 line of credit, and they'd shake their heads. "Pride goeth before a fall," they'd mutter. I heard whispers about interest rates. The papers were talking about inflation, about the Federal Reserve getting ready to clamp down. Rich Sterling just laughed it off. At a town meeting, I heard him tell a group of farmers, "Don't worry about interest rates. With corn at $4, you can pay any rate they throw at you. The game has changed. These prices are the new normal." That fall, I finished clearing my first 10-acre field. The soil was rich and black, protected for a century under rockos and trees. It was the best-looking piece of ground I had ever seen. As I made my last pass with the dozer, smoothing the earth, I saw the dust cloud from Sterling's fleet of combines working on the horizon. They were harvesting thousands of acres, a massive operation of incredible scale and efficiency. And as I watched, a cold wind blew across my new field, a wind that felt like it was coming from a long way off. It carried the scent of winter, and something else too, the unmistakable, metallic smell of debt. And I knew, deep in my gut, that the new normal he was so sure of was about to come to a very sudden, very brutal end. The first sign of the turning tide wasn't a thunderclap. It was a whisper on the radio. It was the winter of 1980, and I was in the small workshop I'd built next to my trailer, grinding a new edge on a cutting tooth for the dozer blade. The news came on between country songs, something about a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The announcer's voice was calm, but the words hit the farmers of Providence County like a physical blow. The biggest customer for American corn and wheat was gone overnight. The price of corn, which had been the foundation of Rich Sterling's paper empire, didn't just fall. It plunged off a cliff. From nearly $4 a bushel, it dropped to $3, then $2.50. It was like the floor had vanished from under the whole agricultural economy. At the co-op, the mood turned grim. Men who had been bragging about their new four-wheel drive tractors a year before were now hunched over their coffee, their faces etched with worry. Their math was simple and terrifying. They had borrowed money based on $4 corn. At $2.50, they weren't just losing money, they were hemorrhaging it. At the same time, another whisper started, this one from the banks in the city. A man named Volcker at the Federal Reserve was going to war with inflation. The weapon he chose was interest rates. The prime rate, the number that dictated the cost of every loan, started to climb. 8%, 12, 15. It kept going, a relentless, vertical ascent. For farmers like Sterling, who had financed their operations on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. The cost of the money he had already borrowed was doubling, then tripling. I saw him one day at the parts store. His face was pale and drawn. He was trying to buy a specific electronic ignition module for his new international combine, a 1480 axial flow. The parts man, old Gus, shook his head. Got to order that from the regional depot, Rich. Be 3 days, maybe a week, and... Gus cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. It's $460. Company policy is cash up front on special orders now. Sterling's jaw tightened. I saw him glance at me, standing by the counter with a couple of cheap hydraulic fittings and a can of starting fluid in my hand. My bill was $7.40. I paid for it with a 10 from my pocket. Sterling pulled out his checkbook, his hand hesitating for a moment before he started to write. The confidence, the easy arrogance, was gone. In its place was a brittle, hunted look. The cracks in his empire began to show. One of his big steigers, the Green Panther, sat broken down at the edge of a field for 2 weeks that spring. The story at the diner was that a planetary gear in the final drive had failed. It was a $10,000 repair, and the dealer wouldn't send a mechanic or order the parts until Sterling settled his outstanding account. He ended up having to hire another farmer to finish his planting for him, a quiet humiliation that everyone noticed. My little 40 acres, however, was an island of stability. The 10 acres I had cleared were planted in oats and alfalfa hay. I didn't need a massive combine to harvest it. I'd found an old Alice Chalmers all-crop 60 pull-type combine at a scrapyard, a brilliant little machine from the 40s. I paid $200 for it and spent a winter taking it apart, cleaning every canvas belt and replacing every bearing. It was slow and it was small, but it worked perfectly, and it didn't owe the bank a penny. I sold the hay to the local dairy farmers, who were also struggling but always needed feed. They paid in cash. I was still doing work with the HD6. In fact, I was busier than ever. Farmers who couldn't afford a new tiling machine would hire me to use the dozer to dig surface ditches to drain a wet spot in a field. When a big tree came down in a storm, they didn't call the professional tree service anymore. They called me. My price was $100 and a tank of diesel. I was the last resort, the man you called when you were out of money, but not yet out of problems. The final, fatal blow for Sterling and so many others came in the form of a letter, a simple, cream-colored envelope from the bank. I saw the mailman making his rounds one afternoon as I was working on a fence. He stopped at Sterling's big new house, the one that sat on the hill overlooking my father's old farm. A few days later, a notice was tacked to the board outside the county courthouse. It was a foreclosure announcement. Sterling Land and Grain Incorporated was in default. All assets were to be liquidated at public auction. The empire was officially bankrupt. The day of Sterling's auction was a mirror image of my father's, but colder, sadder. It was November 1983. A bitter wind whipped across the farmyard, rattling the bare branches of the maple trees. Instead of the hopeful buzz of the early 70s, the crowd was sparse and silent. These weren't neighbors looking for a bargain. They were vultures and ghosts. Bankers in cheap suits stood with their arms crossed, their faces grim. Farmers who were just one bad harvest away from the same fate watched with hollow eyes. I stood at the back, near an old fuel barrel, just as I had stood by the fence row all those years ago. The auctioneer wasn't the fast-talking Henderson. He was a somber man from the city, hired by the bank. He didn't tell jokes. He just read lot numbers and specifications in a flat monotone. The machinery was a tragic sight. The massive, gleaming tractors and combines that had been symbols of progress and prosperity now looked like extravagant follies. The John Deere 4630, the one Sterling had been driving the day he mocked my broken-down Dozer, sold for less than the price of its tires. The big Steiger Panther, the one that had sat broken in the field, went for scrap value. A bank representative bought most of it, bidding just enough to repossess it for the bank's inventory. There were no real buyers. The money had vanished from the county. Rich Sterling was there. He wasn't wearing a clean shirt and smirking. He was huddled in a thin jacket, his shoulders slumped. He looked 10 years older. His wife stood beside him, her face pale, her eyes fixed on some distant point, as if refusing to see what was happening. He saw me standing there. Our eyes met across the yard. There was no superiority in his gaze now, no pity. There was just a vast, empty expanse of defeat. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a gesture of triumph. It was an acknowledgement of a shared, terrible ritual, the brutal sacrament of the auction block. The auctioneer moved on to the land itself. The parcels Sterling had bought up and down the county were sold one by one. They went for a fraction of what he had paid. The land bubble had burst, and the values had collapsed along with the price of corn. Finally, the auctioneer announced the last parcel, the original 160 acres of the Thorne family farm. My heart hammered against my ribs. I watched as the banker, a man I didn't recognize, made the opening bid. It was low, insultingly low. Another man, a speculator from out of state, raised him by a few thousand. They went back and forth, their bids clinical and detached. They weren't bidding on a home. They weren't bidding on generations of sweat and hope. They were bidding on a number on a ledger, an asset to be disposed of. The banker won. The farm my great-grandfather had settled now belonged to a financial institution 100 miles away. The auction was over. The crowd dispersed quickly, eager to escape the cold and the palpable sense of failure. I watched as Sterling and his wife got into an old rusted sedan and drove away. They didn't look back. I was left alone in the farmyard, the wind howling around the empty machine shed. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise. It was the sound of a world ending. I spent the next 2 years working. I finished clearing my 40 acres, turning every square foot of it into productive land. The rock walls I had built stood like ancient fortifications, protecting the rich soil from the wind. The pond provided water for a small herd of cattle I'd bought, paying cash for each one. My farm was a closed loop. The cattle ate the hay I grew, their manure fertilized the fields, and the fields grew more hay. I sold the calves every fall, and that income, along with my dozer work, was more than enough. I lived simply. My trailer was old, but it was warm. My clothes were worn, but they were paid for. The coffee cans under the floorboards were long gone, replaced by a savings account at the small town credit union, the one that hadn't gotten caught up in the frenzy of farm loans. The county around me was a landscape of ghosts. Half the farms along my road were empty, the houses dark, the fields growing up in weeds. The bank owned them, but they had no buyers. They were liabilities, monuments to the death of a dream. The for sale sign on my father's old farm grew faded and tattered. The paint on the barn began to peel. One crisp morning in the fall of '85, I put on my good shirt, the one I saved for funerals and weddings, and drove my old pickup truck into town. I walked into the main office of the regional bank that held the note on my family's land. I asked to see the president. His secretary looked at my calloused, grease-stained hands and my worn work boots with disdain, but she let me in. The bank president, Mr. Abernathy, was a man in an expensive suit who looked tired of dealing with broken farmers. "What can I do for you, Mr. Thorne?" he asked, not bothering to stand up. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm here about the old Thorne farm, the 160 acres on County Road F. You've had it on your books for 2 years. It's not making you any money. The taxes are due, and the barn roof is starting to go." He sighed, leaning back in his leather chair. "It's a difficult market, as you know." "I'll take it off your hands," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "We're not in the business of charity, Mr. Thorne. We'd need to get a fair market price." "The market says it's worth about $400 an acre," I said, my voice steady. "That's what the Johnson place sold for last month. I'm prepared to offer you that, in cash, today." Abernathy sat forward. The word cash had his full attention. In an economy built on credit and default, cash was king. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. He saw the man who had bought a worthless patch of swamp and turned it into a productive farm while everyone else was going broke. He saw the man who ran the old bulldozer, the one who never missed a payment on anything because he never had any. "You have $64,000? he asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a passbook from the Providence County Credit Union. I slid it across his polished mahogany desk. "I do," I said, "and a cashier's check can be ready in 20 minutes. An hour later, I walked out of that bank with the deed to my family's farm in my hand. It was 16 years to the day since I had lost it. I drove straight there. I parked the truck and walked out to the middle of the field where my father had taught me to plow. I knelt down and picked up a handful of the black soil. It was cool and heavy in my palm. It smelled of home. I hadn't cried the day we lost it. I hadn't cried during the long, hard years in the trailer. But I cried then, the tears cutting clean paths through the dust on my cheeks. The work of reclamation began. The two farms, my original 40 and my father's 160, were side by side. I started by tearing out the fence between them. I used the old HD6, its Detroit diesel roaring a familiar song of defiance and power. It pushed over the rotting posts and tangled wire with contemptuous ease, physically erasing the line between my past and my future. I needed help. I couldn't run 200 acres by myself. I heard that Rich Sterling was working at the grain elevator in the next town over, loading trucks for minimum wage. He had lost his house, his wife had left him, and he was living in a small rented room above the tavern. One Saturday, I drove over there. I found him sweeping out dust and spilled corn, his face grim. "Rich," I said. He looked up, startled. He straightened his back, a flicker of his old pride in his eyes. "Thorne, come to see how the mighty have fallen." "No," I said quietly. "I came to offer you a job. I need a hand on the farm. Pay's not great, but it's steady. And there's a small tenant house on the back of the property. It's not much, but it's dry." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He was searching for the trick, the angle, the punchline to the cruel joke his life had become. He found none. He saw only a straightforward offer. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "After everything, why would you help me?" "Because you know this land as well as I do," I said. "And because nobody should have to go through what we went through. Not then, and not now. The job is yours if you want it." He started working for me the next Monday. It was hard at first. The old resentments were like ghosts between us. But the rhythm of the work, the shared struggle against weather and weeds, began to wear them down. He was a good worker. He had lost his arrogance, but he hadn't lost his knowledge. He taught me things about new hybrid seeds, and I taught him how to rebuild the carburetor on an old Farmall M I'd bought to cultivate with. We didn't talk about the past. We spoke of the future, of rain, of crop prices, of fixing the leaky roof on the barn. We were just two men working the soil, trying to build something that would last. Years passed. The farm healed, and in a way so did we. The community, which had once dismissed me as a fool and celebrated Sterling as a king, now saw things differently. They saw my farm, debt-free and thriving, a patchwork of modest fields, healthy cattle and sturdy fences. They saw my father's old barn with a new tin roof, and the rock walls I had built on my first 40, now softened with moss and time. They saw a quiet man who had weathered the storm by refusing to sail in it. I eventually married a good woman from town, and we raised a son in the same house I grew up in. Rich stayed on, living in the tenant house. He never remarried, but he found a measure of peace. He became like an uncle to my boy, teaching him how to identify birds and how to fish in the pond I'd dug so long ago. One evening, when my son Daniel was about 12, I took him out to the old machine shed. In the back corner, covered in a dusty canvas tarp, sat the Alice Chalmers HD6. It hadn't run in years, but I kept it, a silent 10-ton monument to where we had come from. I pulled back the tarp. Daniel looked at the massive, rust-pitted machine in awe. "That's it, isn't it?" he asked. "The one from the stories." "This is it," I said, laying a hand on the cold steel of the blade. "This is the machine that built everything we have." I told him the whole story then. The auction, the $100 bid, the cold nights in the trailer, the condescending laugh from a man who had everything. I told him about the lure of easy money and the crushing weight of debt. "Never forget this, son," I said, my voice low and serious. "The land is honest. It'll give you what you earn. But a loan from a man in a suit, that's a gamble. And the house always wins. Own your iron. Own your land. If you can't pay cash for it, you can't afford it. That's the most important lesson I can ever teach you." He nodded, his young face serious, and placed his small hand next to mine on the blade. In that moment, I knew the lesson had taken root. Now, I am an old man. My hands are gnarled and stiff, but they are the hands of a man who owns his own life. On warm summer evenings, I sit on the porch of the house my grandfather built. I watch Daniel driving the John Deere 720 across the bottom fields, its two-cylinder engine popping a steady, reassuring rhythm. I found it at an estate sale a county over, bought it, and spent a winter restoring it to its former glory. Rich, his hair now white, often sits with me, and we watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. We don't say much. We don't have to. The quiet hum of the prosperous, peaceful land says it all. The HD6 still sits in the shed, a sleeping giant. Sometimes on a quiet night, I think I can almost hear the echo of its angry, hammering roar. It was the sound of my survival. It was the sound of a promise I made to myself in the dirt and despair of an auction yard. $100 promise that became an inheritance, not of money or of acres, but of a simple, unshakable truth that the strongest empires are not built on borrowed ground, but on the bedrock of your own two hands.